One of the more interesting quotations, and I'm sure there'll be many of them published over the next couple of days, from the former Home Secretary, the disgraced Home Secretary, one of the few Home Secretaries who has actively been sacked, it's extraordinary, is the idea that multiculturalism makes no demands on the incomer to integrate. That's what she said. So for those people who are worried, I'm quoting Suella Braverman, not myself. Now, there's many ways of looking at this. First of all, you could do a debate, like, for example, Maya Tusi does, about the difference in multiracialism and multiculturalism. I think that's a sort of fantasy debate. Multiracialism is about the different races in Britain who share a single British culture. Maya says that multiracialism, Britain worked well in the past, he says, because while multiracial, all groups and individuals were integrated into the British culture. Now we have many cultures that refuse or fail to integrate. This harms only our society. That's what he said last year. And I'm inclined to think there's an element which is true there, but I think he's subdividing the same issue. And I don't think there's a big difference between multiracialism and multiculturalism. The problem is this idea of integration. So we might assume that someone who comes to the UK would embrace our values, our way of doing things, our language, our hopes, our aspirations, that they would feel welcome. And it's that idea of feeling welcome which impels somebody to embrace what we promote. I know when I've lived in other countries where I felt welcome, I very comfortably picked up the language and habits. Where I felt less welcome, I found I might be able to pick up bits of these things, but in fact I find myself very reluctant, and as I leave the country, I leave the culture and the language behind. So I really struggle, for example, today to read things, to do things confidently in Russian. But I lived in Russia for about 10 years. On the other hand, my default foreign language is Greek, and I think I still have a local accent. And though I struggle at times, it's 20 years ago since I was last in Greece, 20 years ago since I last spoke Greek on a regular basis. But I feel I still do it. Ivrit, I don't really deal with, but ancient Hebrew, I'm very comfortable with. And German, I found it a really difficult society to live in. I was at school there for a short while, and I found it really tough. My German is hopeless, and so on. Where I felt welcome and where I felt invested, I took on that culture, that language, those ideals. And if the values which we are presented with involve testing the limits of the law, involve questioning the decisions of the police, involve racist ranting abuse about today Albania, tomorrow Pakistan, the next day probably your own country, is it any wonder that newly established immigrants in our country retreat into their own cocoon of non-English speaking security and fail to integrate fully into our society? Because integration means to accept the values of, let's say, Suella Braverman. She is not a good example. We best integrate by example and by encouragement, by following example, by being encouraged, not by demand, legal demand, or knee-jerk screaming. And if Suella Braverman's methods have failed, and they demonstrably have failed, we need now to work on picking up the pieces, because I don't think we can all... What she has done, and what a progressive number of Home Secretaries have done from Theresa May onwards, is to have broken that welcome, is to have broken that sense of integration. So people come to the UK and they feel they're here on sufferance, or they're here until they put a foot wrong and then suddenly they're out on their ear. Why would anybody integrate or embrace our culture with that pressure hanging over us, over them? Why? I think we're going to have to work incredibly hard. And it's not about being left-wing or right. It's not about being in the Conservative Party or the Labour Party. The Conservative Party, by the way, has just as many senior members of the party who came here as children as the Labour Party. So the idea that one party rather than the other has some sort of hold on multiculturalism or multiracialism or integration is absurd. We now all need to work on this, and Suella Braverman, I think, has dealt some sort of death blow to the hopes of welcoming people to integrate fully into our society. But that is what we should be doing. With multiculturalism, let's look at it from the other side. With multiculturalism, what we want is integration plus the benefit of people bringing their own cultural insight, their own cultural pluses into our society, as indeed all immigrants have done back to the Normans, back to the Huguenots, back to the Jewish communities fleeing the pogroms in Tsarist Russia, back to the Irish coming over here and building our railways, our canals, our roads. All our cultures, and the Windrush generation, all our cultures have brought with them a passion for our country because of the welcome that we have given them. And they've also brought their own cultural traditions, which we have integrated into British culture. Think of the significance of the curry in our national diet. That is a result of not only people integrating into Britain, but Britain integrating into the culture which is brought into our land. So I don't think it's as simple as saying it's about different races coming in and then embracing the same culture. There is no one monolithic British culture. It's a fluid thing. But it's a fluid thing that we work on together. And to define that by law, I think, would be to break it. To punish people and to hold them in hotels, which are little more than barely gilded prisons, for endless periods of time because we are carrying out Theresa May's abhorrent, hostile environment, this is where the problem starts to break down. But it is absolutely broken by Suella Braverman's rhetoric, and particularly by her failure to apologise, for example, to Rama, who asked for an apology, or at least a meeting. She never met him. A failure to apologise to Crown Prince Leka of Albania. I believe she never replied. I'm so shocked by the discourtesy, but it's a discourtesy she shares with many other senior ministers in the present government who simply don't reply. And it is wrong. It is wrong, absolutely wrong. And it needs to change. Our values are based on courtesy, civility, and giving anybody of any background a fair hearing. Not just in court, but on the street. Not just in court, but when you go and see your constituency MP. And we've got used to people not replying. You go for a job interview, you go for an audition, and people don't reply if you don't get the job. That's not how I was brought up. And it's wrong. You write a letter and it doesn't find favour with the minister, and they don't bother replying. I've been writing religiously to the ministers for the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. That's Nadine, Dorries, Michelle Donellan and Lucy Frazer, Oliver Dowden. And I can say, with my hand on my heart, not a single letter has been received back in any timely manner. Many of the letters are, I got back eventually, well after 6 months. And one only because I wrote to the Prime Minister's office, Boris Johnson. Now I got a letter back quite quickly, and then I got a very quick letter back from Julia Lopez, who's a junior minister, basically sending me off to somebody else who pointed out that that was an inappropriate direction. But simply that delay, that tardiness, is not part of our character. So which culture does that come from, pray? Which culture? Because it's not ours. So I think that particular statement by Suella Braveman will go down in history. Multiculturalism makes no demands on the incomer to integrate. Integration is a two-way process.